Hey, guys, tonight we're dimming the gas lamps and drawing the heavy velvet curtains, stepping back into an era of grand balls, strict social etiquette, and a whole lot of sleepless nights. Imagine, if you will, the hustle and bustle of a Victorian city, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestone streets, the distant chime of Big Ben, the murmur of 1,000 lives crammed into bustling tenements and elegant townhouses. Yet behind many of those prim facades, in the quiet solitude of the bedroom, a pervasive problem was silently gnawing at the very fabric of society. We're talking about Victorian sleeplessness, an epidemic of insomnia that gripped the era, a constant companion for rich and poor alike, often fueled by the very pressures of their rapidly changing world. You probably won't survive this journey awake, but that's entirely the point, isn't it? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now, down in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a Victorian, living in a world teetering on the edge of massive industrial and social transformation. The gentle rhythms of rural life are giving way to the relentless pace of urban existence. If you're a factory worker, you're enduring grueling hours in dimly lit, noisy environments with the constant threat of injury or job loss. If you're a middle-class gentlewoman, you're navigating complex social expectations, managing a household, enduring restrictive corsets, and perhaps wrestling with the burgeoning anxieties of a rapidly expanding empire. The sheer mental and physical strain of this new era often manifested in one common, unwelcome symptom: the inability to find restful sleep. The air itself felt different. The soot-laden atmosphere of industrial cities, the constant noise, the artificial gaslight, extending the day into the night, all contributed to a restless environment. Your nervous system, accustomed to quieter, darker nights, was constantly stimulated. The concept of nervous disorders was gaining traction, and sleeplessness was almost universally seen as a primary symptom rather than a standalone issue. People felt perpetually overworked, overstimulated, or simply run down. Think about the sheer lack of understanding of sleep science back then. There were no sleep studies, no polysomnographs, no understanding of REM cycles or circadian rhythms. Sleep was simply the absence of waking, a necessary but often elusive state. If you couldn't sleep, it was often attributed to a weak constitution, moral failing, or a mysterious nervous debility. The pressure to be productive, to maintain appearances, and to uphold strict moral codes meant that being unable to sleep wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a sign of weakness, even an embarrassment. Social pressures played a huge role, too. If you were a middle-class wife, your domestic duties were endless, from managing servants to sewing garments and educating children. If you were a man, the cutthroat competition of the burgeoning capitalist economy meant constant worry about financial ruin or professional failure. And for the poor, the constant gnawing of hunger, cold and uncertainty made a good night's rest a rare luxury. The sheer volume of human suffering, both visible and hidden, created a profound undercurrent of anxiety that often found its way into the restless hours of the night. One quirky tidbit: the Victorians were obsessed with rest cures for nervous disorders, often prescribing weeks or even months of enforced bed rest, minimal stimulation, and overfeeding, particularly for women. While perhaps well-intentioned, these long periods of inactivity often exacerbated the very sleeplessness they were meant to cure, creating a vicious cycle of restless nights and dull, overfed days. Historians still argue whether the perceived sleeplessness epidemic was truly a statistical increase in insomnia, or if it was more a heightened awareness and medicalization of a common human experience, fueled by the anxieties of the age and the emergence of new remedies. Either way, the public perception was clear: sleep was hard to come by, and people were desperate for a solution. This desperation, this constant yearning for oblivion from the anxieties of the day, created a fertile ground for anything promising relief, paving the way for the peculiar and often perilous world of Victorian sleep tonics. So, you're a tired Victorian, tossing and turning in your ornate brass bed, the gaslight from the street lamp casting long shadows on your chintz wallpaper. Your eyes are gritty, your mind won't quiet, and the thought of another day without proper rest fills you with dread. Before the era of scientific chemistry truly kicked off, where did you turn for relief from this torment? You'd likely reach for early unscientific remedies, a hodgepodge of home cures, folk wisdom, and traditional practices, some genuinely soothing, others utterly useless, and a few downright dangerous. Imagine your grandmother, wise with years, telling you about the remedies passed down through generations. These weren't concoctions born in a laboratory, but mixtures derived from kitchen pantries, herb gardens, or local apothecaries, relying on centuries-old traditions rather than modern empirical evidence. The prevailing wisdom was often rooted in the idea of balancing humors or simple observations of natural properties. One common approach was herbalism. You might brew a strong tea from valerian root, known for its earthy, somewhat unpleasant smell, but reputed for its calming properties. Or perhaps a soothing infusion of chamomile, still a popular bedtime brew today, its gentle sedative effects offering a mild respite. Hops, often used in beer, were also thought to induce sleep. You might even fill a small pillow with dried hops and place it under your head, hoping to inhale tranquility. These remedies generally aim to soothe the nerves, quiet the mind, or induce a gentle drowsiness. Beyond herbs, various food and drink practices were common. A warm glass of milk before bed, often with a spoonful of honey, was, and still is, a classic. The tryptophan in milk, combined with the psychological comfort of a warm drink, offered a simple, non-addictive solution. A small glass of brandy or port was also frequently recommended, the immediate depressant effect of alcohol, providing a temporary sedative, though often leading to disturbed sleep later in the night. It was the original nightcap promising slumber, but sometimes delivering a headache instead. Then there were the more peculiar or ritualistic remedies. Some people believed in the power of specific scents, like lavender, or even the practice of counting sheep. Yes, that's an old one. Others might try specific breathing exercises or mental visualizations, rudimentary forms of what we now call mindfulness or meditation. These often relied heavily on belief and the power of suggestion. If you truly believed tying a red ribbon around your wrist would ward off insomnia, sometimes it did. One particularly quirky tidbit: some folk remedies involved bizarre external applications. You might be advised to rub onion juice on your forehead or place a fresh cabbage leaf under your pillow. These certainly weren't scientifically proven, but in a world with limited options, people were often desperate enough to try anything. Historians still argue whether the perceived effectiveness of these traditional remedies was due to a genuine, albeit unquantified, pharmacological effect, or primarily the powerful placebo effect. It's likely a mix, with some herbs offering mild benefits and the ritual itself providing psychological comfort. The key takeaway here is the contrast with what was to come. These early remedies were mostly natural, often derived from plants, and generally mild in their effects. They rarely contained potent, isolated chemical compounds. They were the gentle prelude to a much more dramatic and often dangerous era of sleep tonics, an era ushered in by the exciting yet often reckless advancements in the burgeoning field of chemistry. You're reaching for a calming herb, unaware that soon chemists in white coats will be isolating compounds that could knock you out cold or lead you down a path of lifelong dependency. The age of simple brews was about to give way to the age of potent potions. You've tried the valerian tea and the hop pillow, perhaps even that questionable onion juice forehead rub, and still blessed sleep eludes you. But the world around you is rapidly changing, driven by an intellectual revolution that will soon redefine everything, including how you attempt to find rest. This is the dawn of chemistry, a scientific discipline that in the Victorian era was rapidly transforming from an alchemical curiosity into a rigorous empirical science, forever altering the landscape of medicine, and indeed the quest for a good night's sleep. Imagine the bustling laboratories of the mid-19th century. No longer are alchemists secretly trying to turn lead into gold in dimly lit back rooms. Instead, dedicated scientists, often self-taught or trained in burgeoning university departments, are meticulously experimenting, observing, and crucially isolating substances. They're moving beyond simply using herbs whole. They want to understand the active principles within them. This shift from holistic remedies to isolated compounds is the foundational change that will lead to the powerful sleep tonics. Before this era, medicine was largely observational and symptomatic. If you had a fever, you were given something to cool you down. If you couldn't sleep, you were given something to make you drowsy. But chemists began asking why these remedies worked. What specific substance in the poppy plant made it so effective at dulling pain and inducing sleep? What was the active ingredient in willow bark that alleviated fever? This investigative curiosity was the engine of a new pharmaceutical age. The tools of the chemist were becoming more refined. Improved distillation techniques, the development of new acids and reagents, and a growing understanding of organic compounds allowed them to break down complex natural substances into their constituent parts. This wasn't magic. It was methodical, painstaking work, often involving repeated crystallization and purification processes. They weren't just brewing. They were extracting, analyzing, and synthesizing. This new scientific approach brought both immense promise and unforeseen perils. The promise was the ability to create more potent, more reliable, and more consistent medicines. No longer would you have to guess at the strength of your valerian brew. A chemist could, in theory, provide you with a precisely measured dose of its active ingredient. This precision was revolutionary, but the peril lay in the very power of these isolated compounds. When you consume an entire plant, the active ingredient is often buffered by other compounds that might mitigate its side effects or slow its absorption. Isolate that active ingredient, concentrate it, and you create a much more powerful substance, one with a far greater potential for both benefit and harm. The chemists, in their excitement, were often unaware of the full implications of the potent concoctions they were creating. One quirky tidbit: the early chemists often tasted their new discoveries to ascertain their properties. Imagine isolating a new powerful alkaloid from a plant, and your first step is to put a tiny bit on your tongue to see what happens. This practice, while incredibly risky, underscores the adventurous and exploratory nature of early chemical research. Historians still argue whether the rapid advancements in chemistry outpaced the ethical and medical understanding of how these new powerful substances should be used and regulated. It was a period of incredible innovation, but also one of significant blind spots regarding public safety and long-term effects. This nascent field of chemistry, driven by a thirst for understanding and the allure of isolating nature's most potent secrets, was about to unleash a flood of new pharmaceutical agents onto a society desperate for relief. The stage was set for the invention of some of the most powerful sleep tonics the world had ever seen. Substances that would change the very nature of insomnia, promising oblivion, but often delivering dependency. Your local chemist, soon to be a purveyor of these modern marvels, was on the cusp of becoming a central figure in your nightly struggle for rest. The chemist's laboratory is humming with new discoveries. But before we get to the truly synthetic sleep aids, we must acknowledge the undisputed king of Victorian sedatives, a substance so pervasive it was practically woven into the fabric of daily life, opium's ubiquity and appeal. Imagine a world where this powerful narcotic derived directly from the poppy was not a heavily regulated illicit substance, but a common, readily available, and widely accepted remedy for nearly every ailment, including, and perhaps especially, sleeplessness. You see, for centuries before the Victorian era, opium had been known for its potent, pain-relieving, and soporific sleep-inducing qualities. But with the rise of the chemist and the increasing availability of processed forms, its use exploded. The most common form you would encounter wasn't the raw tar-like gum, but a preparation called laudanum. This was opium dissolved in alcohol, often with added spices like cinnamon or saffron to improve the taste. Think of it as the ultimate Victorian equivalent of over-the-counter pain relievers and sleep aids, but with the potency of a modern opioid. Laudanum was incredibly accessible. You could buy it at your local chemist shop, a grocer, or even a general store, often without question or prescription. It was cheap, far cheaper than a doctor's visit, making it the go-to solution for the working poor and the financially strapped middle class. A few drops or a measured spoonful promised instant relief from a host of miseries. Toothache coughs, menstrual cramps, indigestion, and crucially, the gnawing anxiety that kept you awake at night. The appeal was undeniable. In an era before effective pain management or truly understanding mental health, laudanum offered immediate solace. The world outside might be harsh and unforgiving. Your body might ache from labor, or your mind might race with worry. But a dose of laudanum promised oblivion. It wasn't just sleep it offered, but a profound sense of calm, a gentle detachment from suffering. For someone battling chronic pain or severe anxiety-induced insomnia, it must have felt like a miracle. Doctors too widely prescribed opium and laudanum. It was seen as a legitimate and effective therapeutic agent, often the most reliable tool in their limited pharmacological arsenal. They simply didn't understand the long-term addictive properties in the way we do today, or if they did, the immediate benefits often outweighed the perceived risks. The focus was on alleviating immediate suffering, and laudanum certainly did that. One quirky tidbit: laudanum was so common that it was often used casually, much like we might use aspirin today. Ladies of leisure might take a few drops to calm their nerves before a social engagement or to soothe their children, a practice we'll delve into later. It was a ubiquitous part of the medicine cabinet, reaching into nearly every household across the social spectrum. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of laudanum was a testament to its effectiveness in an age of suffering or a tragic example of unchecked access to a dangerous drug. It was likely both reflecting a desperate society finding relief in the most powerful and ultimately problematic agent available. This era of pervasive opium use set the stage for the true chemical revolution in sleep aids. Once chemists began to isolate the active principles from natural substances like the poppy, they could create even more potent and refined versions of these soporific agents. The groundwork was laid by laudanum's widespread acceptance, creating a demand for reliable sleep inducers that the burgeoning chemical industry was all too eager to fill. The gentle, if often dangerous embrace of the opium poppy was about to be refined into something even more precise and even more perilous. You've seen how ubiquitous opium and its alcoholic tincture, laudanum, were in Victorian society practically the go-to for any discomfort, including, of course, the torment of sleeplessness. But the true scientific revolution in sleep aids wasn't simply about dissolving opium in alcohol. It was about taking a giant leap from simply using raw plant material to pinpointing and extracting its very essence. This is where chemists isolate active compounds, a breakthrough that transformed pharmacology and paved the way for modern medicine, but also for more potent and often more dangerous sleep-inducing substances. Imagine a dedicated chemist, perhaps, working late into the night in a quiet, cluttered laboratory. Their goal isn't just to make a tincture. It's to find the specific molecule within the poppy plant that causes its pain-relieving and sleep-inducing effects. This was painstaking work involving repeated processes of extraction, purification, and crystallization. It was the ultimate chemical detective story. The most famous success story in this endeavor was the isolation of morphine from opium. In 1803, a young German pharmacist's assistant named Friedrich Serturner managed to isolate the active alkaloid responsible for opium's effects. He named it morphine after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, a fitting tribute to its powerful soporific qualities. Imagine the excitement. Here was a pure crystalline substance, far more potent and predictable than crude opium or laudanum. A tiny dose could achieve what large quantities of the raw drug did. This isolation of morphine was revolutionary for several reasons. Firstly, it allowed for much more precise dosing. Before, the strength of laudanum could vary wildly depending on the quality of the opium and the preparation method. With pure morphine, doctors could administer a known quantity theoretically, leading to more consistent and safer outcomes. Secondly, it opened the door to injection. The invention of the hypodermic needle in the mid-19th century meant morphine could be directly injected into the bloodstream, offering incredibly rapid and potent relief from pain and inducing sleep almost instantly. This rapid onset, while seemingly a blessing, would become a major factor in addiction. The success with morphine spurred other chemists to seek out active compounds from other medicinal plants. They were isolating strychnine from Nux vomica quinine from cinchona bark for malaria, and cocaine from coca leaves. This was the era of the alkaloids' powerful nitrogen-containing compounds that formed the backbone of many early pharmaceutical drugs. Each discovery held the promise of a targeted, powerful therapeutic agent. One quirky tidbit: initially, morphine was even marketed as a non-addictive alternative to opium. The thinking was that if the pure substance was used in precise doses, it wouldn't lead to the same problems as crude opium. Oh, how wrong they were. This highlights the nascent understanding of addiction during this period. The focus was on the immediate effect, not the long-term consequences. Historians still argue whether the isolation of these active compounds was primarily driven by scientific curiosity or the burgeoning commercial opportunities presented by a society desperate for more effective medicines. It was likely a potent combination of both. The desire to understand nature's secrets, coupled with the immense market demand for relief from suffering, created an unstoppable wave of pharmaceutical innovation. The isolation of morphine was a pivotal moment. It validated the chemical approach to medicine and demonstrated the immense power that could be harnessed from natural substances. It also set a precedent. If a natural substance could yield such a powerful sleep aid, what could chemists create entirely from scratch? The stage was now set for the truly synthetic hypnotics drugs that didn't just extract from nature, but actively engineered oblivion. You've witnessed the power of isolated compounds like morphine, a pure, potent extract from the poppy. But the ultimate triumph of Victorian chemistry, at least in the quest for synthetic sleep, lay not in refining nature's gifts, but in creating something entirely new. This brings us to chloral hydrate, the first synthetic hypnotic drug that revolutionized the treatment of insomnia, for better and often for worse. Imagine a chemist in 1869, perhaps the eminent German chemist Justus von Liebig, or more specifically Oskar Liebreich, who first introduced it to medicine. They weren't just extracting from plants anymore. They were building molecules in the laboratory. Chloral hydrate was one of the earliest truly synthetic organic compounds to be widely used as a pharmaceutical. Its discovery and medical application marked a significant turning point, the transition from natural remedies, even purified ones, to entirely man-made drugs designed for specific physiological effects. The appeal of chloral hydrate was immediate and profound. Unlike morphine, which had a strong analgesic pain-relieving effect and was known to cause constipation, chloral hydrate was primarily a hypnotic. Its main action was to induce sleep quickly and effectively, with less of the immediate pain-relieving side effects of opiates. For a society plagued by sleeplessness, this was a revelation. It offered oblivion without the obvious high or constipation that accompanied laudanum, making it seem deceptively like a cleaner, safer alternative. You could take a dose and within minutes you'd feel a profound drowsiness wash over you, quickly pulling you into a deep sleep. It was highly effective, often more so than anything else available at the time. This rapid action made it incredibly popular, especially among doctors who were desperate for reliable ways to quiet restless patients or induce calm in those suffering from acute anxiety or delirium. It quickly became the go-to sedative in hospitals and asylums. However, chloral hydrate was far from benign. Its initial allure quickly gave way to a darker side. It was highly caustic and could cause severe irritation to the stomach lining, often requiring it to be diluted in water or syrup. More dangerously, its therapeutic dose was perilously close to its toxic dose. Overdoses were not uncommon and could lead to respiratory depression, cardiac arrest, and death. It was the original knockout drops, and indeed it was famously or infamously used for this purpose, sometimes to nefarious ends. The Victorians called it knockout drops, or Mickey Finn, for a reason. Furthermore, despite initial hopes, chloral hydrate proved to be highly addictive, and its long-term use led to chronic toxicity, producing symptoms like skin rashes, digestive problems, and a general decline in health. Withdrawals were severe, mimicking delirium tremens, cementing its place as a dangerous yet indispensable part of the Victorian pharmacopoeia. One quirky tidbit, chloral hydrate, made an appearance in famous literature. In Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it is suggested that Dr. Jekyll used chloral hydrate to achieve his transformations, hinting at its known powerful and disorienting effects. Historians still argue whether the medical profession fully grasped the dangers of chloral hydrate during its peak use, or if the desperate need for effective sedatives overshadowed a thorough understanding of its long-term risks. It was a Faustian bargain, immediate powerful sleep, in exchange for potential addiction and severe side effects. The advent of chloral hydrate marked a pivotal moment. It proved that chemists could synthesize potent targeted drugs. It ushered in an era where sleep could be commanded not just by nature's extracts, but by man's ingenuity. But it also laid bare the profound ethical and safety challenges inherent in such power, setting the stage for future debates about drug regulation and patient safety debates that in some form continue to this very day. You could finally buy sleep in a bottle, but it came with a hefty, often hidden price tag. You've seen the potent yet perilous rise of chloral hydrate, the first synthetic sleep inducer. But the Victorian chemists weren't content with just one knockout drop. Their relentless pursuit of calming remedies led them to another significant class of compounds that promised to soothe frayed nerves and invite gentle slumber, the bromides, particularly potassium bromide. Imagine a society constantly feeling nervous, agitated, or overwrought, and a new chemical solution emerging that seemed to offer a much-needed antidote to the pressures of modern life. The use of bromides as sedatives began around the mid-19th century, gaining significant traction in the 1850s and 60s. Unlike the powerful immediate punch of chloral hydrate or the comprehensive effects of opium bromides, were seen as more gentle acting, primarily as a depressant on the central nervous system. They didn't necessarily induce deep, immediate sleep in the same way, but rather aimed to calm overactive nerves, reduce anxiety, and generally tranquilize the patient, thereby making sleep possible. Think of them as the Victorian equivalent of anti-anxiety medication, rather than a pure hypnotic. Potassium bromide was the most commonly used, often dissolved in water or mixed into various elixirs. It was prescribed for a wide range of nervous complaints that were thought to stem from an overstimulated nervous system. This included epilepsy, where it was revolutionary in controlling seizures, hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis, especially for women encompassing everything from anxiety to depression, various forms of nervous debility, and of course the ever-present problem of insomnia. If your mind was racing, if you felt a constant internal tremor, the bromides offered a subtle, pervasive calm. The appeal was that they seemed less overtly intoxicating than opium, or as acutely dangerous as chloral hydrate in single doses. They allowed you to function, albeit perhaps a bit dully, while quietly dialing down your internal agitation. For someone perpetually on edge, the prospect of simply feeling less nervous was incredibly appealing. It was a quieter kind of relief, a gentle suppression of the internal storm. However, like most Victorian chemical wonders, bromides came with their own set of significant drawbacks, often unrecognized or downplayed at the time. Chronic use of bromides led to a condition called bromism, a form of poisoning. Symptoms could include skin rashes resembling acne, slurred speech, mental dullness, memory problems, confusion, hallucinations, and even psychosis. It was a slow, insidious decline, often mistaken for a worsening of the original nervous complaint, leading doctors to prescribe more bromide, thereby accelerating the patient's deterioration. It was a vicious cycle where the cure slowly became the affliction. One quirky tidbit about bromides is their taste. They were notoriously bitter and salty, making them quite unpleasant to take. Chemists and patent medicine manufacturers would go to great lengths to mask this taste, often mixing them with sweet syrups, alcohol, or other flavorings, which sometimes contributed to the overall danger or addictive potential of the tonic. Imagine having to choke down a bitter concoction every night just to quiet your mind. Historians still argue whether the medical community truly understood the chronic toxicity of bromides, or if the perceived success in treating immediate symptoms overshadowed the subtle, long-term harm they inflicted. The advent of bromides broadened the arsenal of Victorian chemists in their fight against sleeplessness and nervous disorders. They represented a different approach, aiming for gentle sedation and nerve calming rather than outright oblivion. But their long-term use created a new set of problems, highlighting once again that the pursuit of sleep through chemistry was a path fraught with unintended, often devastating consequences. You might be feeling a bit calmer tonight, but at what cost to your wits and your skin in the months to come? You've now seen the powerful, sometimes dangerous chemicals emerging from Victorian laboratories. The purified morphine, the synthetic chloral hydrate, and the calming bromides. These weren't just confined to the doctor's bag or the asylum ward. They rapidly made their way into the homes of ordinary Victorians through a phenomenon that truly defined the era's approach to self-medication, the patent medicine mania. Imagine a deluge of brightly colored bottles, elaborate labels, and sensational advertisements, all promising miraculous cures, especially for that elusive thing called sleep. You see, the Victorian era was the golden age of patent medicines. Before stringent regulations, anyone could mix up a concoction, slap a fancy name on it, claim it cured everything from consumption to corns, and sell it to an eager public. These weren't patented in the modern sense of a protected formula, but rather their names or branding were trademarked, making them proprietary medicines. The actual ingredients were typically secret guarded jealously by the manufacturers. Why did they explode in popularity? Several factors converged. Firstly, as we've discussed, there was a genuine and widespread need for relief from various ailments, including chronic pain, anxiety, and pervasive sleeplessness. Doctors were expensive, and their treatments often limited or ineffective. Self-medication was a necessity for many. Secondly, the burgeoning advertising industry was a powerful force. With mass-produced newspapers and magazines, manufacturers could reach millions of potential customers with their compelling, often outrageous claims. Advertisements for these tonics promised not just sleep, but a return to health, vitality, and happiness. They tapped into people's deepest fears and desires. Thirdly, these tonics were incredibly accessible. You could buy them almost anywhere: the chemist shop, the grocer, traveling salesman, even by mail order. They were sold alongside groceries and household goods, normalizing their purchase and consumption. This widespread availability, combined with the desperate search for relief, made them a staple in many Victorian homes. The typical sleep tonic or nerve calmative bottle might contain a mix of the potent ingredients we've discussed, liberal amounts of opium or morphine, often disguised or not explicitly listed, to guarantee drowsiness and pain relief. Chloral hydrate might be present for a powerful knockout effect. Bromides would be included to calm generalized nervousness. And to make it palatable or to add an extra kick, copious amounts of alcohol were almost always a primary ingredient. Imagine a blend of sedatives, pain relievers, and a significant alcoholic punch, all marketed as a harmless, soothing syrup. One particularly quirky tidbit is the names these concoctions bore. They often sounded harmless or even charming, designed to evoke trust and relief. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Godfrey's cordial, Dover's powder, Dalby's carminative, or Dr. Collis Brown's chlorodyne. These names masked the fact that they were often little more than potent cocktails of habit-forming drugs. Historians still argue whether the manufacturers were fully aware of the addictive properties of their products, or if they genuinely believed in their curative powers, perhaps dismissing addiction as a moral failing of the user rather than a chemical consequence. It was likely a spectrum with some genuinely deluded and others knowingly exploiting the desperation of their customers. The patent medicine mania created a culture of self-prescription fueled by aggressive advertising and a profound lack of regulation. For the sleepless Victorian, these brightly labeled bottles offered a seductive promise, a peaceful night, a calm mind, all for a few pence. But beneath the alluring facade lay a hidden danger, laying the groundwork for widespread addiction and a significant public health crisis just waiting to be uncovered. You've seen the flood of patent medicines brimming with powerful secret ingredients, promising oblivion from the relentless anxieties of Victorian life. But how did these unassuming bottles, often tucked away on a chemist's shelf, actually convince a cautious public to take a chance on them? It was all about marketing the magic cure, an art form that the Victorians perfected, turning fear and desperation into a powerful sales pitch. Imagine newspapers and magazines plastered with advertisements, not just small notices, but full-page evocative appeals directly to your deepest vulnerabilities. The advertising for these sleep tonics and nerve calmers was remarkably sophisticated for its time, often preying on the widespread ignorance about pharmacology and the prevailing social anxieties. They weren't selling a drug, they were selling a dream. The dream of a peaceful night, a quiet mind, a return to vitality and social function. Firstly, the names themselves were a crucial part of the marketing. As we touched on, they were designed to inspire trust and benevolence. Mother's Friend, Soothing Syrup, Restorative Elixir. They sounded gentle, natural, and nurturing, belying the potent and often dangerous compounds within. The promise was often subtly implied, rather than explicitly stated: calms the nerves, promotes natural rest, relieves irritation. These vague claims allowed them to sidestep direct medical scrutiny while still conveying the desired message. Secondly, the use of testimonials was rampant. Advertisements would feature glowing letters from supposedly grateful customers describing their miraculous recovery from debilitating sleeplessness, nervous collapse, or chronic pain. These testimonials often employed dramatic language, painting vivid pictures of suffering, followed by joyous relief, creating a powerful emotional appeal. Before using Dr. So-and-so's drops, I was a wreck, unable to sleep a wink, a burden to my family. Now, thanks to this wonderful tonic, I sleep like a baby and wake refreshed. You can almost hear the heartfelt sighs of relief. Thirdly, the imagery was carefully crafted. Advertisements often featured serene, well-rested individuals, sometimes with cherubic children sleeping peacefully beside them, a truly disturbing image given the ingredients often present. The visual rhetoric was all about peace, health, and domestic harmony, restored subtly, suggesting that the tonic was the key to achieving this idyllic state. Fourthly, they capitalized on the widespread distrust of traditional doctors, who were often expensive and whose treatments could be ineffective or even barbaric. Think bloodletting and purges. Patent medicines presented themselves as a democratic alternative, accessible and affordable, putting the cure directly into the hands of the people. They suggested that you didn't need a fancy physician, you just needed this simple secret formula. One particularly quirky tidbit is the use of celebrity endorsements, Victorian style. While not always famous actors, manufacturers might secure endorsements from respected figures in society, like clergymen or local dignitaries. further lending an air of credibility to their products. If your vicar used it, it must be safe and effective. Right, historians still argue whether the patent medicine manufacturers were simply shrewd businessmen exploiting public ignorance, or if they genuinely believed in the efficacy of their products, perhaps fueled by early, uncontrolled success stories. It was likely a blend with an undeniable talent for persuasive communication. The marketing of these magic cures was a masterclass in exploiting human vulnerability. For the sleepless Victorian, constantly bombarded by the anxieties of their age, these advertisements offered a tantalizing glimmer of hope, a promise of escape into the sweet oblivion of sleep. They were selling not just a liquid in a bottle, but a return to peace, quiet, and a functional life, a promise that for many was simply too appealing to resist, regardless of the hidden dangers. You've seen the persuasive advertisements and the appealing names of these Victorian sleep tonics, but what exactly were you pouring into your glass? The answer lies in their often secret, yet remarkably potent, and sometimes highly dangerous ingredients, secret and seductive. Imagine a brew that promised calm, yet delivered addiction, all while being marketed as harmless relief. The manufacturers of patent medicines guarded their formulas fiercely. They weren't required by law to list ingredients on their labels, allowing them to create an aura of mystery and proprietary knowledge. This lack of transparency was a deliberate choice, enabling them to include powerful, habit-forming substances without public scrutiny. For you, the consumer, it was a leap of faith into a bottle of unknown contents. However, historical analysis of surviving bottles and recipes, along with contemporary medical observations, reveals a consistent pattern of key ingredients. And these were no mild herbal teas. The absolute cornerstone of most effective sleep tonics was opium, or its derivatives, especially morphine. Often, these were the primary active ingredients that guaranteed the soothing or calming effect. Manufacturers might use raw opium or more refined morphine sulfate dissolved in a solvent. Because these were incredibly effective sedatives and pain relievers, they truly did deliver on the promise of inducing sleep and alleviating discomfort, at least in the short term. This made the tonics incredibly seductive. They worked. Another common and powerful addition was alcohol. Many of these tonics were essentially alcoholic tinctures, meaning the active ingredients were dissolved in a high-proof spirit, often brandy or whiskey. The alcohol itself contributed significantly to the sedative effect, and its presence also helped preserve the mixture. Some tonics contained as much as 40 to 50% alcohol by volume, equivalent to strong spirits. Imagine taking a dose that was essentially a shot of hard liquor combined with a powerful opiate. It's no wonder people felt drowsy. As we discussed earlier, chloral hydrate was a key synthetic addition once discovered. Its potent hypnotic action made it an ideal component for knockout drops or strong sleep-inducing formulas. Its presence guaranteed a rapid onset of sleep, further cementing the tonic's reputation for effectiveness. Bromides, particularly potassium bromide, also featured heavily, especially in tonics marketed for nervousness or agitation. While slower acting than opiates or chloral hydrate, they provided a general calming effect that would eventually lead to sleep. Their presence contributed to the overall sedative load of the tonic. Beyond these primary active ingredients, manufacturers would often add various other components. These might include flavorings to mask the often bitter taste of the active chemicals. These could be anything from sugar and honey to licorice, cinnamon, or peppermint oil. Colorings. To make the tonics look appealing, often a deep amber or reddish hue. Other active ingredients, sometimes less potent, often ineffective herbs or compounds, were added to flesh out the secret formula and add a veneer of natural goodness, even if the real punch came from the hidden drugs. One quirky tidbit about these secret formulas, the very ambiguity of the ingredients, meant that manufacturers could adjust the potency as they wished, often increasing the dose of opiates or alcohol to ensure customer satisfaction and repeat business without having to declare it. This created a highly inconsistent and unpredictable product for consumers. Historians still argue whether the patent medicine industry was primarily driven by a genuine belief in their products or by a cynical exploitation of public desperation and the lack of regulation. It was likely a murky blend of entrepreneurial spirit and ethical negligence. So when you reached for that bottle of Dr. So-and-so's miraculous sleep elixir, you weren't just taking a pleasant-sounding tonic. You were consuming a powerful, often highly addictive cocktail of drugs, cleverly concealed and seductively marketed, all designed to deliver that longed-for oblivion, but at a hidden and often devastating cost. You've seen the secret ingredients and the seductive marketing that filled the shelves of Victorian chemist shops. Now let's consider you the sleepless Victorian, and why, despite the unknown dangers, you so readily turned to these bottles. This is the story of self-medication trends, revealing the compelling reasons why ordinary people chose to take their health and their slumber into their own hands. Imagine your life in the mid-19th century. If you're poor, a factory worker, or a domestic servant, access to medical care is a luxury. Doctors' fees are prohibitive, and even if you could afford one, their treatments might involve painful procedures, ineffective remedies, or simply a dismissive attitude towards your nervous complaints. You can't afford to take time off work for prolonged illness, and a sleepless night means a terrible, unproductive day, potentially leading to job loss. Desperation, pure and simple, drove many to seek relief elsewhere. Even if you were moderately well off, the medical profession was still evolving. There was no scientific basis for many diseases, no antibiotics, no advanced pain relief beyond opiates. If your doctor couldn't offer a quick, effective solution for your crushing migraine or your persistent insomnia, what else were you to do? The patent medicine offered a readily available alternative, promising swift relief and, perhaps more importantly, hope. The Victorian era was also marked by a strong belief in individual agency and self-reliance. While this often manifested in moral rectitude and hard work, it also extended to personal health. You were expected to manage your own well-being, and if a convenient over-the-counter remedy promised to help you do that, why wouldn't you try it? The idea of taking responsibility for one's health sometimes meant bypassing the formal medical establishment altogether. The sheer accessibility and affordability of these tonics were also key. A bottle of soothing syrup or nerve elixir was far cheaper than a doctor's visit and a prescription. You could simply walk into a chemist shop or general store, lay down a few pennies, and walk out with a potential cure for your suffering. There was no social stigma attached to buying these widely advertised products. They were seen as legitimate household staples. Furthermore, the very nature of Victorian society fostered a culture ripe for self-medication. The relentless pace of industrialization, the strict social codes, the repression of emotions, and the rapid urban growth all contributed to widespread anxiety, depression, and physical ailments. Sleeplessness was seen as a symptom of this pervasive nervousness. These tonics offered a quick escape, a way to numb the sharp edges of a demanding world and simply get some rest. For many, it was the only way to cope. One particularly quirky tidbit: the alcohol content in many of these tonics often provided an immediate sense of well-being and drowsiness, blurring the lines between medicinal effect and mild intoxication. For those who couldn't afford regular alcohol, these tonics might have served a dual purpose, offering both a sedative effect and a cheap buzz, further fueling their appeal. Historians still argue whether the widespread self-medication reflected a failure of the formal medical system to meet public needs, or if it was a symptom of a society grappling with rapid change and immense psychological stress, leading individuals to seek immediate, easily accessible comfort. Ultimately, for the average Victorian, the choice to self-medicate with these tonics was a rational response to a challenging environment. Faced with pervasive suffering, limited medical options, and readily available, powerfully effective in the short-term solutions, you reached for the bottle that promised solace and sleep. You simply wanted to feel better, to get some rest, and these tonics for a time seemed to deliver that coveted peace, even if the price of that peace was a hidden growing dependency. You've made the decision to self-medicate, a common choice in Victorian society, driven by genuine suffering and limited alternatives. But where exactly did you go to procure these omnipresent magic cures? For the ordinary Victorian, the answer was often the very heart of the community, the allure of the chemist shop. Imagine stepping into a place that was a fascinating blend of apothecary, general store, and even a bit of a mystical emporium where the promise of relief was bottled and displayed. The chemist shop of the Victorian era was far from the sterile, brightly lit pharmacies of today. Picture a storefront with large glass jars filled with colorful liquids, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, and the distinct aroma of various chemicals, spices, and tinctures mingling in the air. Behind the counter, the chemist himself, for it was almost always a he, would often be a respected figure in the community, part scientist, part businessman, part trusted advisor. The role of the chemist was multifaceted. They dispensed prescriptions from doctors, certainly, but they also compounded their own remedies, often based on traditional recipes or their own experiments. Crucially, they were the primary retailers of the ubiquitous patent medicines. So, if you were seeking a sleep tonic, you didn't necessarily need a doctor's note. You simply walked into the chemist, pointed to the bottle you'd seen advertised, and bought it. This accessibility was a huge part of the allure. The chemist shop was often a social hub, a place where you could not only purchase remedies, but also seek informal advice. The chemist might offer a recommendation based on your symptoms, or simply hand over the popular soothing syrup you requested. There was a sense of trust in this local figure, a belief that they knew their products and genuinely wanted to help. The shop itself was a visual feast designed to inspire confidence and curiosity. Rows of neatly labeled bottles, gleaming brass scales, and polished wooden counters created an impression of scientific precision and traditional wisdom. The very act of purchasing a remedy from such a place felt legitimate and reassuring. It was a stark contrast to the often intimidating and impersonal doctor's surgery. One quirky tidbit about these shops: many chemists cultivated their own secret formulas for popular ailments, including sleeplessness, that were effectively their own brand of patent medicine. They might advertise these within their local area, building a reputation for their unique blends. This meant that while some tonics were nationally advertised brands, many were local concoctions mixed right there in the back of your neighborhood chemist. Historians still argue whether the chemists genuinely believed in the efficacy of all the patent medicines they sold, or if their role was simply that of a retailer, responding to public demand, balancing their scientific understanding with commercial imperatives. It was likely a complex ethical tightrope, with the promise of profit often winning out. For the sleepless Victorian, the chemist shop represented hope. It was a place where, without judgment or extensive inquiry, you could find a bottled promise of oblivion, a temporary escape from the anxieties of the day. The chemist, with his calm demeanor and rows of mysterious bottles, was seen as a gatekeeper to a peaceful night, providing an essential service to a society constantly yearning for rest. This trusted local figure often unwittingly became a key facilitator in a growing silent epidemic of drug dependency. You've frequented the alluring chemist shop, bottle in hand, seeking solace from the ceaseless demands of Victorian life. But this quest for sleep and the consumption of tonics wasn't uniform across the bustling social landscape. Instead, it was deeply intertwined with social class and consumption, revealing fascinating patterns about who used these remedies, why, and what unspoken rules dictated their intake. Imagine the vast chasm between the soot-stained lives of the working class and the seemingly genteel existence of the upper echelons. Both experienced sleeplessness, but their approaches to relief and the substances they consumed often differed in form, if not in underlying chemical effect. For the working class and the poor, patent medicines were often a lifeline. As we've discussed, doctors were largely unaffordable. A few pennies for a bottle of soothing syrup was a practical, accessible solution to chronic pain from grueling labor, persistent coughs, or the relentless anxiety of poverty and precarious employment. These tonics, especially those with high alcohol or opiate content, offered an immediate, if temporary, escape from grim realities. They allowed exhausted laborers to get enough rest to face another day, or numb the pain enough to continue working. There was less emphasis on nervousness and more on blunt, effective, symptomatic relief. Then, consider the middle classes, particularly women. For them, the problem of sleeplessness was often framed as nervous debility, hysteria, or overstimulation. The social pressures to maintain a pristine household, raise obedient children, and uphold rigid moral standards were immense. The emotional repression inherent in Victorian society often manifested as anxiety and insomnia. For these women, a discreet bottle of nerve tonic was a way to cope without admitting weakness or seeking formal medical help that might reveal an embarrassing condition. The tonics allowed them to maintain their composure and function within their demanding social roles, often without their husbands or acquaintances being fully aware of their dependency. It was a private struggle, often masked by the veneer of respectability. For the upper classes, direct purchase of patent medicines might have been less common, seen as a bit vulgar. Instead, they had access to private physicians who would often prescribe carefully compounded preparations containing similar potent ingredients like laudanum or morphine, perhaps mixed in more elegant, bespoke formulations. They might also indulge in opiate use in a more recreational context or for chronic, vaguely defined ailments, often with a doctor's complicity. The consumption was more controlled, more discreet, but the underlying chemical dependency could be just as severe. One quirky tidbit revealing class differences. Working-class families might simply administer a few drops of laudanum directly to crying children. A horrifying practice we'll delve into soon, while middle and upper-class families might use the more respectable patent soothing syrups for the same purpose, perhaps feeling a greater sense of moral justification due to the tonic's advertising claims. Historians still argue whether the perceived higher incidence of nervous disorders among middle and upper-class women was a genuine phenomenon, or largely a cultural construct, allowing them a sanctioned outlet for the immense pressures they faced, often managed with these sedative tonics. Ultimately, sleep was a universal human need, but the path to achieving it in Victorian society was deeply stratified by class. Whether it was the cheap, potent oblivion sought by the struggling laborer, or the discreet prescribed calm desired by the anxious gentlewoman, these sleep tonics permeated every level of society, silently reshaping lives and fueling hidden dependencies, all under the guise of restoring peace to the restless Victorian night. You've seen how Victorian sleep tonics permeated every social stratum, from the factory floor to the drawing room. But there's a particularly dark and disturbing aspect to this story that exposes the severe lack of understanding and oversight of the era. The use of these potent concoctions on the most vulnerable members of society, children, and soothing syrups. Imagine a desperate mother, utterly exhausted by a crying, restless infant, reaching for a bottle that promised to bring peace, unaware of the insidious dangers lurking within. In an age before modern pediatrics, effective pain relief for children, or even a basic understanding of infant physiology, parents faced immense challenges. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high, and a crying colicky or teething baby could push even the most loving parent to the brink of despair. Sleep for both child and parent was a precious commodity. It's in this context of genuine need and widespread ignorance that soothing syrups for children became incredibly popular. These syrups, often marketed with idyllic images of sleeping babies, were presented as harmless remedies for a fussy child. Their names were once again deceptively gentle: Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, Godfrey's Cordial, Dalby's Carminative. They promised to calm teething pain quiet, a cough alleviate digestive upset, and above all, ensure a peaceful night's sleep for both the infant and the exhausted parents. But the secret ingredients we discussed earlier were present in these child-specific formulas, often in alarmingly high concentrations given the small body weight of an infant. Opium, or morphine, was the primary active ingredient, guaranteeing a potent sedative effect. Alcohol was also a major component, acting as both a solvent and an additional depressant. Imagine giving your baby a spoonful of what was essentially an opiate-laced, high-proof alcoholic beverage. The effect was undeniable. The baby would quickly become quiet, drowsy, and eventually fall into a deep, often unnaturally heavy sleep. For a parent driven to exhaustion, this immediate relief must have felt like a miracle. The child stopped crying, and the house fell silent. But this peace came at a terrible cost. The frequent and prolonged use of these syrups led to widespread infant addiction. Babies would develop a physical dependency on the opiates, suffering withdrawal symptoms if the syrup was withheld. Their tiny bodies were ill-equipped to handle such powerful drugs, leading to chronic constipation, malnutrition, as they would be too sedated to feed properly, developmental delays, and a general state of lethargy. Tragically, accidental overdoses were also common. Without standardized dosing or clear ingredient lists, a well-meaning parent might accidentally administer too much, leading to respiratory depression and frequently death. These fatalities were often dismissed as overlaying accidental suffocation by a parent in bed, or attributed to other infant ailments, masking the true cause. One particularly horrifying detail: some manufacturers even advised giving these syrups to infants before long journeys, specifically to keep them quiet, or even before public appearances, so the child would be docile. Historians still argue whether the scale of infant deaths directly attributable to these syrups was fully understood by the public and authorities at the time, or if it remained a largely unacknowledged tragedy, lost amidst high general infant mortality rates. It was a dark secret, hidden in plain sight, a heartbreaking testament to parental desperation and unchecked pharmaceutical power. The legacy of these soothing syrups serves as a stark reminder of the urgent need for drug regulation and a scientific understanding of medication. The sweet promise of sleep, so easily given to innocent children, was often a veiled pathway to dependency, ill health, and even premature death. A chilling chapter in the history of Victorian chemistry's pursuit of oblivion. You've just been introduced to the tragic reality of children's soothing syrups, a stark example of the hidden dangers within Victorian sleep tonics. This leads us to the inevitable, widespread, and largely unacknowledged consequence of their ubiquity addiction, the unintended consequence that silently ravaged countless lives across Victorian society. Imagine a gradual, insidious dependency where the very cure for sleeplessness or pain became an inescapable torment, a shadow lurking beneath the era's polite veneer. You see, in the Victorian era, the concept of drug addiction as a disease or a chemical dependency was poorly understood. Instead, it was often viewed as a moral failing, a weakness of character, or a lack of willpower. If you became dependent on a substance, it was your fault, a sign of depravity, rather than a physiological response to powerful chemicals. This moralistic view meant that addiction, when recognized, was cloaked in shame and secrecy. Yet despite this judgmental societal lens, addiction was rampant. The very effectiveness of the sleep tonics and pain remedies packed with opium, morphine, alcohol, and chloral hydrate guaranteed it. When you took a dose and felt the blissful calm, the easing of pain, or the rapid onset of sleep, your body and mind quickly learned to associate that relief with the bottle. The brain's reward system, completely unknown at the time, was being powerfully hijacked. For the working class, a daily dose of laudanum might be the only way to endure back-breaking labor or chronic illness. For the middle-class woman, a secret swig of her nerve tonic might be the only way to manage the crushing anxieties and social pressures of her life. They weren't seeking to become addicts. They were seeking relief, and the drugs delivered it so effectively that dependency became an almost unavoidable side effect of long-term use. Withdrawal symptoms, though often unrecognized as such, were terrifying. Imagine the restlessness, the intense cravings, the stomach cramps, diarrhea, muscle aches, and profound anxiety when a dose was missed. To escape this agony, you would inevitably reach for the bottle again, cementing the cycle of addiction. And because the problem was rarely openly discussed, you might feel utterly alone in your struggle believing yourself uniquely weak or morally corrupt. The sheer accessibility of these substances fueled the crisis. Without prescriptions or regulation, a continuous supply was easy to obtain. The local chemist, unaware or unconcerned about the long-term effects, simply restocked the popular remedies. It was a vicious loop. Sleeplessness led to tonics. Tonics led to addiction. Addiction led to more tonics to stave off withdrawal, and the cycle continued. One particularly poignant example of this silent epidemic was the respectable opium eater, or the laudanum drinker. Unlike the stigmatized opium dens of the East End, many Victorians, particularly women, consumed opiates privately in the comfort of their homes, often believing they were simply managing a chronic ailment. Their addiction was a secret burden hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles. Historians still argue whether the medical community or even the manufacturers deliberately downplayed the addictive nature of these products for commercial gain, or if their understanding of addiction simply lagged far behind the chemical reality. It was likely a blend of both, with a powerful profit motive obscuring a nascent medical understanding. The widespread, insidious grip of addiction was the silent, devastating cost of the Victorian chemists' quest for soothing sleep. It created a generation unknowingly enslaved by the very remedies designed to free them from suffering, a profound tragedy that would eventually force society to confront the unregulated power of its own chemical innovations. You've seen the widespread, often hidden problem of addiction plaguing Victorian society, a direct result of unchecked access to potent sleep tonics. As the consequences of this self-medication craze became increasingly undeniable, a critical mass of concern began to grow among a segment of the medical establishment. This marks the dawn of emerging medical ethics and the first hesitant calls for regulation from within the professional ranks. Imagine a few far-sighted doctors and pharmacists looking beyond immediate symptoms to the devastating long-term effects, beginning to speak out against the tide of unregulated remedies. Until this point, the medical profession, while respected, was largely fragmented and lacked a unified voice or regulatory power over proprietary medicines. Doctors operated largely independently, and their primary concern was often the immediate relief of suffering, which the potent patent medicines undeniably provided. The idea of public health oversight on a broad scale was still in its infancy. However, as more and more cases of chronic bromism, opium addiction, and chloral hydrate poisoning came to light, some physicians and apothecaries began to raise alarms. They witnessed firsthand the physical and mental deterioration of their patients who were reliant on these cures. They saw the confusion, the skin rashes, the gastrointestinal distress, and the profound dependency that often masked the original ailment. It became clear that what started as a solution was frequently morphing into a new, even more intractable problem. These early critics weren't always successful in immediately stemming the tide, but they laid crucial groundwork. They began publishing articles in medical journals, presenting case studies that highlighted the dangers of unlisted ingredients and uncontrolled dosing. They argued for the importance of proper diagnosis and prescribed treatments rather than unchecked self-medication. Their arguments were often rooted in a growing understanding of physiology and pharmacology, starting to connect chemical compounds directly to their long-term effects on the body, rather than just their immediate symptomatic relief. The burgeoning field of toxicology also played a role. Scientists were becoming more adept at identifying poisons and their effects, lending a more scientific voice to the warnings against indiscriminately consuming powerful, unlisted chemicals. It wasn't just a moral failing, it was a matter of chemical poisoning. One of the key arguments these medical reformers made was for transparency. They demanded that manufacturers disclose the active ingredients in their products. This was a radical idea in an era of trade secrets and proprietary formulas, but it was seen as essential for both patient safety and the integrity of the medical profession. If you knew a soothing syrup contained a dangerous amount of morphine, you might think twice before giving it to your child. One quirky tidbit: some of these early medical crusaders faced significant opposition, not just from the powerful patent medicine industry, who had vast advertising budgets, but also from elements within the public who preferred the convenience and lower cost of self-medication over the often more expensive and less immediately effective treatments offered by doctors. It was a classic clash between consumer demand and professional ethical responsibility. Historians still argue whether the medical community's awakening to the dangers of patent medicines was primarily altruistic, driven by genuine concern for public health, or if it was also motivated by a desire to professionalize and assert control over the lucrative market for remedies. It was likely a complex mix of both a nascent professional identity grappling with profound societal problems. These early voices, though perhaps a minority, at first represented a crucial shift in thinking. They were the pioneers who began to push for a more regulated ethical approach to medicine, arguing that the pursuit of immediate relief, particularly for something as fundamental as sleep, should not come at the cost of public health and long-term well-being. Their efforts would eventually lead to legislative action, marking the beginning of the end for the unbridled patent medicine mania. You've heard the rising concerns from medical professionals, the first whispers of ethical unease about the rampant self-medication and its dark consequences. These voices, coupled with increasing public awareness of the dangers, slowly but surely began to build pressure for change. This pressure culminated in a landmark piece of legislation, the Pharmacy Act of 1868, a crucial, though imperfect step towards regulating the chemical Wild West of Victorian medicine. Imagine the debates in Parliament, the lobbying from medical societies, and the resistance from powerful patent medicine manufacturers. It wasn't an easy fight, but the growing evidence of addiction, accidental poisoning, and the sheer deceitfulness of many secret formulas finally forced the government's hand. The public was becoming more aware of the risks, and the medical community was increasingly vocal about the need for control. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 was a significant achievement because for the first time it created a legal distinction between certain powerful drugs and everyday commodities. Its primary aim was to restrict the sale of poisons. It mandated that certain poisons, which included substances like opium, morphine, arsenic, and prussic acid, could only be sold by registered chemists and druggists. Furthermore, these sales had to be entered into a poisons register with details of the purchaser and the amount sold, and the container had to be clearly labeled as poison. This was a revolutionary step. Before this act, you could walk into almost any shop and buy potent drugs. Now, if you wanted pure opium or morphine, you had to go to a professional chemist, and they had to record your purchase. This measure was designed to prevent accidental poisonings and to make it harder for individuals to acquire large, dangerous quantities of narcotics for illicit purposes or self-harm. However, and this is a crucial point, the Act had significant limitations, particularly when it came to the very sleep tonics and patent medicines we've been discussing. The Act primarily focused on the sale of pure poisons. It did not require patent medicine manufacturers to disclose their ingredients. This was a massive loophole. So, while you couldn't easily buy a bottle of pure morphine, you could still buy a soothing syrup that contained a substantial, unlisted amount of morphine, along with a good dose of alcohol. Manufacturers quickly adapted. They simply ensured their products, though chemically potent, didn't fall neatly into the poison category as defined by the Act when sold in their pre-mixed proprietary forms. They continued to market their secret formulas, secure in the knowledge that they weren't legally compelled to reveal what was inside. It was a classic example of legislation lagging behind scientific and commercial realities. The spirit of the law was to protect, but the letter of the law left plenty of room for exploitation. One quirky tidbit: the Act did lead to some chemists subtly adjusting their formulas to avoid the poison label, if they could, while others simply ensured they complied with the labeling and registration requirements for the more potent substances they sold individually. This created a two-tiered system. Raw poisons were controlled, but proprietary blends remained largely unchecked. Historians still argue whether the limitations of the 1868 Act were due to genuine legislative oversight, powerful lobbying from the patent medicine industry, or simply the immense difficulty of trying to regulate complex chemical compounds with limited scientific understanding of their long-term effects. Despite its flaws, the Pharmacy Act of 1868 was a foundational step. It signaled a growing public and governmental recognition that chemical substances needed regulation, that consumer protection was becoming a legitimate concern. While it didn't immediately halt the widespread consumption of dangerous sleep tonics, it lit the fuse for future, more comprehensive reforms, proving that the silent problem of addiction and the dangers of unknown ingredients could no longer be completely ignored. Your nightly quest for sleep was slowly, imperceptibly becoming a matter of public policy. You've seen the legislative attempt to rein in the Wild West of Victorian remedies with the Pharmacy Act of 1868, a crucial but limited step. However, laws alone weren't enough to curb the deep-seated reliance on potent sleep tonics. What truly began to turn the tide was a combination of increasing scientific understanding and perhaps, more powerfully, the harsh glare of public scrutiny brought on by public awareness and scandal. Imagine a slow creeping realization across society that those soothing elixirs in their medicine cabinets might actually be the source of untold suffering and even death. For a long time, the side effects of these tonics, the dullness, the constipation, the strange rashes, the eventual dependence were often dismissed or misdiagnosed. If you were addicted to opium, it was your moral failing. If your child languished, it was a weakness in their constitution. But as more individuals suffered, and as a few brave medical professionals and investigative journalists began to connect the dots, the truth became harder to ignore. Newspapers and magazines, once prime advertising space for these very tonics, slowly began to carry articles detailing the dangers. Stories of accidental overdoses, particularly of children, started to appear with more frequency, no longer hidden behind polite euphemisms. The tragic death of a child from Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, or a well-known figure wasting away from a nerve tonic, began to stir public outrage. These were not abstract medical cases. They were deeply personal tragedies, hitting close to home for many. Medical journals also continued their quieter but persistent campaign, publishing detailed accounts of bromism and chronic opiate poisoning, providing empirical evidence that the patent medicine manufacturers couldn't easily refute. Scientific understanding of addiction, while still nascent, was slowly shifting from a purely moralistic viewpoint to one that acknowledged the physiological grip of these powerful substances. Perhaps one of the most significant forces in raising public awareness was the rise of investigative journalism, particularly in the late Victorian and Edwardian eras. Muckraking journalists began to systematically expose the secrets behind the patent medicine industry. They sent samples of popular tonics to laboratories for analysis, revealing the shocking quantities of alcohol, opium, and other potent drugs, often far exceeding what was safe or ethical, especially for children. They exposed the flimsy scientific claims, the fake testimonials, and the cynical marketing tactics. One famous example of this kind of expose was Samuel Hopkins Adams's series of articles in Collier's Weekly, starting in 1905, later compiled in his book, The Great American Fraud. While this was an American phenomenon, it reflected a broader transnational concern and certainly influenced public opinion in Britain. These revelations often caused public outcry, leading to calls for stricter regulation and greater transparency. The public was horrified to learn that the harmless cough syrup they'd given their children contained enough opiate to create addiction, or that their nerve tonic was simply a highly alcoholic solution designed to dull their senses rather than cure their ailments. One quirky tidbit, some of these exposés even highlighted how many prominent temperance advocates, those against alcohol, were unknowingly consuming large quantities of alcohol in their favorite patent medicines. This hypocrisy, once revealed, further eroded public trust in the manufacturers. Historians still argue whether the public's eventual rejection of these tonics was primarily driven by scientific evidence or by the emotional impact of scandal and exposé journalism. It was likely a powerful combination, where scientific facts finally had a public platform through compelling narratives of tragedy and deceit. The era of unbridled patent medicine mania, including the pervasive use of sleep tonics, was slowly drawing to a close. The light of public awareness, ignited by scandal and fueled by genuine suffering, was beginning to expose the dark underbelly of a market built on secret ingredients and seductive promises. The Victorians were waking up, often literally, to the dangers that had been quietly sedating them for decades. You've witnessed the public awakening to the hidden dangers of Victorian sleep tonics, largely fueled by scandalous revelations. This growing awareness wasn't just about outrage. It was underpinned by fundamental changes in how medical science understood the human body and the effects of chemicals on it. This is the story of shifting scientific understanding, a gradual but profound pivot from anecdotal observation and traditional remedies to a more rigorous, evidence-based pharmacology. Imagine scientists moving from simply knowing that a substance works to understanding how and why it works, and crucially, what its full range of effects might be. In the early Victorian era, medicine was still largely a mix of art experience and inherited tradition. If a remedy seemed to alleviate symptoms, it was considered effective. The concept of clinical trials, as we know them today, with control groups and statistical analysis, was virtually non-existent. Dosage was often imprecise, and the idea of side effects beyond immediate acute toxicity was poorly understood. However, as the 19th century progressed, the science of physiology began to flourish. Researchers gained a much deeper understanding of how different organs functioned, how the nervous system transmitted signals, and how chemicals interacted with biological processes. This wasn't just about what happened when you took a drug. It was about understanding the underlying mechanisms of action. For instance, the discovery of neurotransmitters, though still in its infancy, began to offer hints at how substances like opiates actually affected the brain to induce sleep or dull pain. The field of pharmacology emerged as a distinct scientific discipline, moving beyond mere pharmacy, the preparation of medicines, to the systematic study of drug actions, effects, and mechanisms. Pharmacologists began to conduct experiments, often on animals, to determine precise dosages, identify therapeutic windows, the range between effective and toxic doses, and meticulously document side effects. This shift from "this works" to "this works because" was revolutionary. This meant that the understanding of sleep itself also began to change. While still far from modern sleep science, there was a growing recognition that sleep wasn't just a passive state, but an active, physiological process. This led to a more nuanced approach to insomnia, looking beyond simple nervousness to potential underlying causes that might require more targeted, less blunt interventions. The new scientific rigor also brought a more critical eye to the claims of patent medicine manufacturers. When a tonic claimed to cure everything, pharmacologists, armed with their new understanding of specific drug actions, could easily identify the absurdity of such broad claims. They could demonstrate that the cure was often just a powerful sedative masking symptoms rather than addressing the root cause. One quirky tidbit is the initial enthusiasm for some of these powerful new compounds, even among scientists, before their full dangers were understood. For example, cocaine, after its isolation, was initially hailed as a miracle drug, even promoted by figures like Freud for its stimulating and mood-lifting effects before its addictive nature became painfully clear. This underscores how new scientific understanding is always a process, often with unforeseen consequences, even for the most brilliant minds. Historians still argue whether the medical and scientific communities embraced this new rigorous pharmacology quickly enough, or if the inertia of tradition and the commercial power of the patent medicine industry slowed its widespread adoption and the consequent public health reforms. Ultimately, the shifting scientific understanding was a slow-burning fuse. It provided the intellectual ammunition for medical reformers and the evidence base for legislators. It gradually stripped away the mystique from the magic cures, revealing them as complex chemicals with specific, often dangerous effects. This intellectual revolution set the stage for modern drug development and, crucially, the rigorous regulatory frameworks that would eventually aim to protect you from the very kind of soothing sleep tonics that plagued your Victorian ancestors. Section 20. You've witnessed the entire journey from the restless nights of Victorian England through the dawn of chemistry, the rise of potent patent medicines, the hidden scourge of addiction, and, finally, the slow awakening of scientific and public awareness. As we gently draw this narrative to a close, we arrive at the enduring legacy from cures to controls, understanding how the chaotic era of Victorian sleep tonics fundamentally shaped the modern regulatory landscape and your relationship with pharmaceuticals today. Imagine looking at a modern pharmacy shelf. Every single bottle, every pill, every liquid medication you see is there because of a long, often painful history of trial and error, of scientific discovery and public tragedy. The rampant, unchecked sale of those secret, seductive Victorian sleep tonics directly led to the regulations that protect you today. The revelations about hidden opiates in children's syrups, the insidious nature of bromism, and the widespread unacknowledged addiction crisis spurred a global movement towards drug control. It became painfully clear that simply leaving manufacturers to their trade secrets and consumers to their desperation was a recipe for public health disaster. This eventually led to legislation that required ingredient labeling. No more secret formulas. You now have the right to know exactly what you're putting into your body. This was a direct response to the deceptive practices of the Victorian patent medicine era. Furthermore, the understanding of addiction evolved from a moral failing to a medical condition, leading to stricter controls over narcotic substances. The gradual implementation of prescription-only drugs for potent substances, rather than their over-the-counter availability, was a direct consequence of the widespread addiction seen with opium, morphine, and chloral hydrate. No longer could you simply walk into a chemist and buy a powerful sedative without a doctor's oversight. This was a monumental shift, placing control and responsibility squarely on the shoulders of qualified medical professionals. The very field of pharmacology matured, moving beyond simply finding substances that worked. It embraced rigorous testing, clinical trials, and a deep understanding of dosage, pharmacokinetics, how drugs move through the body, and long-term side effects. This systematic approach, driven by the desire to prevent future disasters, is why modern drugs are subject to such intense scrutiny before they ever reach your medicine cabinet. Even the way we talk about sleep and insomnia has changed. While challenges remain modern, medicine seeks to understand the root causes of sleeplessness, stress, lifestyle, underlying health conditions, rather than simply masking the symptom with powerful, undifferentiated sedatives. The emphasis is on holistic health and targeted treatment, a far cry from the Victorian one-bottle-fits-all approach. One quirky legacy, the term quack medicine or snake oil salesman, is a direct cultural echo of the Victorian patent medicine era, a testament to the enduring memory of those who peddled false hope and dangerous concoctions. Historians still debate whether the lessons from this period have been fully learned, pointing to new waves of prescription drug crises in the modern era. But the fundamental frameworks for regulation were undeniably forged in this crucible of Victorian necessity and excess. So, as you finally drift into your own sleep tonight, perhaps reaching for a gentle herbal tea or simply embracing the quiet of your room, spare a thought for those restless Victorians. Their desperate quest for sleep and the often perilous cures they embraced laid the foundation for the carefully controlled, scientifically regulated world of medicine you inhabit today. The hidden dangers of their soothing tonics were a hard-won lesson, ensuring that your path to a peaceful night's rest is far less fraught with peril than theirs ever was. The rhythmic hum of the modern world slowly fades, replaced by the soft cadence of your own breath. The flickering gaslights of the Victorian era have long been extinguished, and the clamor of the steam engines has quieted to a distant echo. The chemists' strange, potent elixirs have been replaced by carefully regulated compounds, their dangers understood, their powers harnessed with caution. You are no longer tormented by the mystery of sleeplessness in a world without answers. Instead, you rest in the soft glow of knowledge, knowing that the struggles of the past pave the way for the comforts of your present. Let the last worries of the day gently dissolve like sugar in a cup of warm milk. Your eyelids feel heavy. Your body sinks deeper into the mattress. The soft fan whispers its lullaby, guiding you to a calm, untroubled slumber. All the history, all the struggle has faded into the quiet hum of peace. Sweet dreams.